Hello, it's time to begin tonight, and we're going to be continuing with the flood. In this lesson, we'll be focusing on the ark and the earth. Now, the flood occurs in Genesis 6 through 8, and some basic information is that man had dominion over creation at this time, but was becoming more violent and more evil. So creation had to be judged, and Noah alone was seen as righteous in this generation, so only he and his family, whom he represented, were saved. In a basic timeline of the flood, Noah spent about 370 some days in the ark. The whole earth was covered for about a maximum of 110 days, and it would have taken some time to reach that point. Genesis 7 shows that it took 40 days for the ark actually to be lifted up into the water, before then they're sitting on land. And then on day 150, that's when the ark struck the mountains of Ararat. And at day 278, that's when vegetation had returned to the earth. So just some basic markers that the Bible gives us of a time frame of the flood. First, though, we need to make sure that we know this was a worldwide event. There are a number of phrases that point to this in the Old Testament. The word, or something equivalent to all, is used in a number of verses, all flesh, under the whole heavens. The word for destruction or wipe out is maka, which means to obliterate, so to completely destroy. And it says, every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from mankind to animals, to crawling things, and the birds of the sky, and they were wiped out from the earth. Or, all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. All flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creature that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. The New Testament also supports this being a worldwide event, especially since it seems to compare this to Jesus' coming judgment. If the judgment of the old world, of the pre-flood world, was only partial, that means that Christ's judgment is partial. But if the pre-flood world judgment was completely worldwide, completely world destruction, then so will Christ judge everything. And if this was a local event, then Noah and the animals did not need to build a boat. They could have walked there given enough time. The water says to raise above the hills, above the mountains, 15 cubits. No way for that to occur, since water would always go downhill. Can't get above something unless there's something containing it. The birds could have just flown away, and the promise of the rainbow would not be much of a promise at all. If the flood was just a local flood, the promise never to flood again would either be false or empty. This all points to this being a worldwide event. The Bible is clear in that, and we will show that the data that we have today is also clear in supporting that. But first, we're going to be looking at the ark. So sit right back and hear a tale of a faithful ship. Sorry, I couldn't resist. So the ark could have two potential sizes, and this is based upon the cubit. There are two kinds of cubits. The shorter cubit, that's about 17.5 inches, elbow to knuckles basically. And then the other one that's longer that goes to the fingertips. So 17.5 to about 21.25 to a half inches. Now, for most of the larger constructions in Hebrew history, the royal or the Hebrew long cubit was used. And that's why when you see a number of these studies, they will use the royal or the Hebrew long cubit. It also seems to make a lot more sense as far as stability and such like that, as we'll go into here in a bit. But overall, assuming that the 30 cubits height was divided into 3 floors, that would give about 1 acre worth of area per floor, or 483 semi-trailers of volume, quite a bit of space. But we don't know potentially all the information. We have this information from Moses, who received it from God, but we don't have the information that Noah received. So he very well could have had more information than what we have. And as such, we don't know the exact shape of the ark. We know its dimensions, but not its shape. We know the shape fit those dimensions, but not the specifics. And so it is assumed by some that the ark was cube-shaped, like a box. Others assume that since it was fitting the function of a ship, it would have looked a bit more like a ship. As far as the word used, it is the word teba, which is used also to mean the basket that Moses was placed in. Those are the main two uses of it in the Old Testament, and it's hard to get all the nuances of a term based upon two uses. It could be based upon shape, or that it simply means lifeboat, since both were used to save a life and both were placed in water. But there are also a few other terms that we don't know the exact nuances to them. Some words that are translated as room in the English are actually literally nest, or the pitch is literally covering, and the window is actually literally a noon window. We don't know a lot of the nuances with this. The translators will use their best judgment in translating that into the best possible English word. So there is some uncertainty about the specifics of the ark. But as far as its dimensions, we can go pretty far with that, and the dimensions are very sound. There was a study done with the Korean Ship Research Center, led by a Dr. Hong, who is an evolutionist. Showed that the ark could handle at least 98-foot waves, most likely more. And it was the perfect mix of comfort, stability, and strength, or at least close to perfect. In each one, it did not do the best, it was average. But when all three were taken into account, it was near perfect. There was one thing, though, that would have made it slightly more perfect: a shorter hull. That's because when boats are in the water, they tend to get broached. So to prevent that broaching, being turned on the side by the waves, a shorter hull would have been more efficient. Now, this study assumed that the waves were coming from every direction. That would give the shorter hull an advantage. But in the ocean, waves come usually from one direction. Depending which ocean you're in, that tells you what direction, as well as a few other things. But usually it's all coming from one direction. But that would also further give the favoring to a short, wide hull. So that is why you will see things like those on the right at the Ark encounter, because the wind mentioned in Genesis 8:1, using that as a wind catch and using a water catch on the front would have aligned that with the waves. And that would give the benefit to the longer hull. So when you go to the Ark encounter, that is the reasoning behind this shape. There is some uncertainty about that specifically, but this is, the best of our knowledge, the most efficient method model of the Ark that we have knowledge of today. But we're not sure of that. We're only sure of the dimensions. Now, many of you probably asking, could the Ark still exist? We do have ships that are almost as old as the Ark. This ship here from Egypt probably was made within the first few hundred years after the flood. And Josephus has accounts of the Ark existing at that time, not first-hand accounts, but second and third-hand accounts. So it's possible. But many of the places that you will see, say, find Noah's Ark here, they all can't be the place. So if you're trying to find that information, use a hefty portion of salt with that. It's a bit beyond our study today, but if you have more questions about that, you have any ideas, please talk with me. I'd love to talk more about that. But about the animals on the Ark, there are an estimated 8.7 million species today. Thankfully, he didn't have to take all of them. He only had to take the land-dwelling, air-breathing animals. And if you remember from the definition of life, insects may or may not have been included. That being said, if they were included, it wouldn't really change much. They don't take up much space or eat a ton. At least not when you have pairs of them. Now, Noah didn't take even the species. He took the kinds. Now remember, a kind is the basic building block of a biblical animal. Species can interbreed. Even genuses can interbreed. But all the creatures within the family, in general, can breed. Beyond that, though, no. The classes and above can't interbreed anymore. So that seems to point to these being the ones that can produce after their own kind. And based upon the modern taxonomy, that would be the family level for most vertebrates. There are some exceptions, but most will be at the family level. And some will claim that Noah couldn't possibly have gotten these. But if you read carefully, Noah didn't go get them. They were brought to him. So of these 8.7 million species, 98% are fish, invertebrates, those creatures that don't have backbones, and non-animals like plants and such. So that gives us fewer than 34,000 species of known land-dependent vertebrates today. So there have been some more, but this is a good starting point. There have been 2 of every kind, and we get this kind based upon hybridization studies, but this numbering system here, the people that did these calculations, always took the higher number. So if they were unsure, then they always went with the higher amount. Bats, for example, we don't have all that data in yet. There could have been only about 7 to 14 or as many as 300 bats on the ark. Could be all one biblical kind, could be several kinds, we don't know yet. And then as far as the clean animals, literally it is 7-7, a male and a female. So it could have just been 7, or it could have been 7 pairs. Now they went with the 7 pairs, and I do agree that that's most likely the correct understanding of that verse there, but it can be translated both ways. So that gives us about 1,400 kinds, or about 6,800 animals. And you can see here some deviations based upon mammals, birds, reptiles, and so on. So with those 1,400 kinds on the ark, 7,000 animals, that would have included dinosaurs. And that means that the average spacing of each animal would have been about 18.5 square foot. Now the average dinosaur is about the size of a buffalo. This is adult dinosaurs. And there are estimated 50 to 80 different kinds. But with all this taken into account, the average adult mass of these creatures would have been, for 15% of them, would have been over 22 pounds, which means the vast majority would have been smaller than a beagle, and most much smaller. So the large creatures would have been in the severe minority. And that being said, that's for adult creatures. Most likely, Noah took young creatures, not the full-grown longnecks. This fits a number of things. They take up less space, they eat less, therefore they produce less waste. They're more durable, they seem to handle the strain and stress of what would have been a very horrific voyage much better. They would produce less young on the ark and produce more young after the ark. It's much better to take a creature at the beginning of its reproductive cycles than halfway through its cycles. And most animals take about a year to mature, or at least many do. Dogs, for example, take an 8-week-old puppy. You're going to have a year-old dog at the end that can start to breed. Now, all these animals would have been eating quite a bit. It's estimated that they would need about 400 tons. That's assuming an 80% dry matter ratio there. That doesn't really matter much, just remember their amount, unless you like to do animal nutrition with cattle and such, which I don't think there's many. Now, they likely all ate vegetation. They took the same food that Noah and his family would eat, and at this time, humans were still only allowed to be vegetarians. So grains, grasses, seeds, nuts, that kind of thing. And they could have stored them in these earthen jars there very well, very easily. But what about the picky eaters? Today we have creatures that can only exist on a very specific diet. Koalas, for example, they can only eat eucalyptus leaves for the most part. Now, the creatures today are much less genetically diverse than the ancestors of them. Remember, we talked about Adam and Eve, how they had all of mankind's genetic diversity within them because of the heterozygosity and such. Same thing was likely for the animals. So the koala today is very specialized. It has lost some genes just due to inbreeding, and so it can only exist on eucalyptus leaves and a few others. So most likely the ancestors of the koala, which we find in the fossil record, existed on many other things. Anteaters also, while they do eat mainly insects today, they can eat fruits and eggs in captivity. Most likely they would have been able to eat such things more readily at that time. As far as water, they could have collected water from the surface of the top of the ark. They could use bamboo as a natural plumbing source and use valves and spigots to move it around to certain containers, as you can see the picture there. They would have only needed about 1 inch of rain per week for everyone on the ark, and as you can expect, with the rain and such, they would have had quite a bit of that. So they could have stored plenty of that. And when you have all these creatures eating and drinking, they'll be producing a lot of waste, quite a bit, a few tons each day. And they could have taken care of this with silk floors, slated floors, basically using bamboo pipes as well for this, and collected it and done what they needed to with that or dispose of it. Most likely they would not have used bedding just because it would have created a lot more problems, but they could have figured out a way. And then most likely would have had an animal transfer system. Anyone who has mucked out a horse's stall will know they don't want to have the horse in them when the floor can suddenly tilt at a 20-degree angle. it would have been very dangerous, especially with the large creatures. So they most likely would have had some sort of animal transfer system. And all this technology is shown in the ancient archaeological record. We have piping well before the Romans. I believe it was the Minoans, and we will get to that at a later date. But this technology is all shown in the archaeological record. And remember, Noah went through 2 technological reshifts. Basically, Noah and his family didn't have all the technology, all the understanding of mankind before the flood. So that a lot of our knowledge, a lot of our understanding was lost. And then the Tower of Babel. Not each of those family groups had that information, had all of mankind's knowledge. Therefore, a lot of knowledge was lost from each of those groups. So there were 2 technological resets in this time period. So Noah here likely was the most technologically advanced person for quite some time. Are there any questions about the feasibility of the ark and the animals on that? Okay.
You know that the most dangerous creatures on the ark would have been the large herbivores.
Now, all of them would have been herbivores at the time, but what we think of large herbivores today, the like long necks and such, the cows and stuff like that.
Just because of their size.
Exactly. The ship would have been tilting at horrible angles because of the many waves, and we will get into that hopefully a little bit today, but most likely next time. And it would not have been a pleasant trip for anyone involved. And so it would have been very dangerous even just walking around. I'm sure, has anyone seen some of those north shipping or fishing vessels, how sometimes the camera will move and all of a sudden you'll see a guy fly across the room because of the angle of the ship. It would not have been a pleasant voyage by any means. Any other comments? Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Next, we're going to be talking about, in general, plate tectonics, the movement of the earth. Now, the Bible doesn't give us a lot of detail on this, but when you take what the Bible gives us and then extrapolate that based upon the information that we have today, it paints a pretty devastating picture of the destruction of the earth. First, we need to go into how the earth is structured. We have an inner core that's thousands of kilometers deep, and we have a good idea of what it's made of a stiff, solid iron nickel, based upon vibrations and the effects on objects in space. It's a lot of physics, and we won't go into detail on that, but if you want to, pick up a textbook and you can start that journey. The outer core is likely made of the same kind of material, but at a different viscosity, closer to like water. And again, based upon transverse waves, compressional waves, we can do the math on that. Both models tend to agree on that, both the biblical and the evolutionary model. The mantle then is the majority of what the earth is made of. And it is what you think when you think of magma. Excuse me. Very hot, very high pressures. Now the crust is so thin that you shouldn't be able to see that on that picture there in the top right. It is incredibly thin, and there are 2 kinds of crust. There is the continental crust that's about 35 kilometers thick on average, and that's of course where the continents are. And even some of the shallow seas are still continental crust. You can see there the connection of Russia and Alaska. That's continental crust underneath that ocean there. And the thickest that it can be is about 70 kilometers in the Himalayan mountains. Ocean crust is a lot thinner, about 5 to 8 kilometers thick, and tends to be a bit dense, meaning that it's going to float lower on the mantle. Think of these as floating blocks of, well, the rock, but think of them as floating blocks. And so the denser one is going to float lower, and the thinner one is going to leave more space from the top of that one and the top of the thicker one. And that's why we have the oceans today, is because the ocean crust is thicker and floating lower. Or not thicker, thinner, but more dense, and thus floating lower. Excuse me. And the ocean crust is actually warmer than what we'd expect, even with the biblical model, meaning that was produced more recently. But there are some areas that are colder and denser even than the current ocean crust. And so with this knowledge, we will then assume that the ocean crust pre-flood was this thicker, denser, colder ocean crust. And this crust is actually so dense that it should not be floating on the mantle. Denser things should not float. Ice floats because it's less dense. Wood floats because it's less dense than the water. But this material should not be on top. it actually should be sinking, but it's not. That's because of where it is today, but before the flood, likely the entire ocean floor would have been this kind of material. And just like aluminum floating on the floor or on the water, it can float there for some time until something pushes it under, then it goes down quick. But what was that thing that initiated everything going underneath the water? Was it an astronomical event, something from space? Was it radioactive heat buildup? Was it something from the earth? Or was it the hand of God when he shut the door of the ark? Something triggered this dense, cold ocean crust that is floating on something that it should not be to suddenly dive down. And so when it does that, it's going to create a few different things: spreading, subduction, and mantle-wide flow. And we'll go into each of those because all these would have occurred at the exact same time. Now, first, we're going to get, let me back up for a second. So when all these three things occur, you're also going to get a 43,000 mile supersonic jet stream across the globe. So think of it as an enormous geyser all over the world, shooting a ton of water everywhere. And we'll get into the mechanism behind this. Then that new, hotter ocean crust is going to push up on the water, causing all the oceans to basically spill over onto the land. The ocean floor could have rose about 3,300 feet even. And we'll get into the mechanisms. First, we're going to talk about subduction. So this denser, colder pre-flood ocean crust somehow starts to dive underneath the mantle. It is pushed and broken and goes underneath the mantle, underneath the continental crusts. Don't know what triggered this, but something did. When it does this, it's going to create a number of events. One, it's going to create a lot of friction. That's going to make it hotter, which means that the mantle is going to be more viscous, more watery, because when you heat things up, it makes things flow easier. And so it's going to start fast and get faster. And all this friction, all this movement is going to create a lot of earthquakes. Instead of having a major earthquake every few decades, you're going to have an even bigger earthquake every few minutes. And all this heat is going to make a lot of volcanic activity, making a lot of volcanic eruptions above. You can see there all that's in the image there at the bottom right. Potentially, this could have gone 7 miles per hour on average. That's pretty fast. I mean, that's as fast as I can walk even when I brisk walk. And so all this is going to create a large effect upon the earth. A Dr. Baumgartner made a model with this in the 1980s. He took what was in the Bible, put the calculations, and let the computer go. It gave this being as the main mechanism for this to occur. And then a number of years later, we can actually see this plate, see this ocean crust way down in the mantle there. This is based upon temperatures in the top right. The blue is the colder ocean crust from before. It should not be there because if this occurred slowly, it would have melted by now. Yet, since this only occurred about 4,500 years ago, it is still relatively cold and going quite deep. Now, all this cold rock going into the mantle, which is normally very hot rock, would have made a lot of movement as far as the currents, the same way as when you put cold and hot, it's going to get things moving. Now, there is a barrier in the mantle at the 670 kilometer mark. There's a change in density, and nothing was thought to go below that, at least when this model first came out. We've then seen that not only does this crust go beyond that, but there are some images of it against the inner core, or not the inner core, the outer core, sorry. The outer core at the bottom of the mantle. There at the 2,900 kilometer mark. And that's going to create a number of problems. So you're going to have all this mantle moving around, making a lot of movement, we call it convection currents. And you can see there how this one plate in Central America goes way deep, over 1,200 kilometers deep. Others went relatively shallow. So not all of them went that deep, but the fact that any of them went deep is a major mystery. But it makes sense with the evolution, with the biblical model. Now, when you have all this cold material on the outer core, it's going to create a number of magnetic changes because the outer core is what gives us our magnetic field. So all this cold material would have basically have caused a reduction of our magnetic field to a tenth of what it was, and then caused it to flip relatively quickly, about every 2 weeks, based upon the biblical model, the biblical timeline of the flood. Now, with all this movement down below and the crust of the ocean being pulled off, you're going to get a lot of hot magma coming up where the ocean crust split. This is going to be about 1400 degrees Celsius, coming in contact with very cold ocean water. And that's going to create that geyser I mentioned before. It is going to propel that up to staggering heights, about 50,000 miles long and 60,000 feet high wall of water. Some of this water would have even come from the magma itself. But all of this would have created, or at least added to, the 40 days of rain at the beginning of the flood. And this magma then turns into new crust. And we see this new crust today at the bottom of the ocean floors. All over, all oceans have this new crust. And they don't even go as far back as to the beginning of the flood. This occurred for the entire flood duration. And we only can go back about 2/3 through the flood at most. Before that, we don't even have that ocean floor. That new ocean floor went through and around pretty far. And with this new ocean crust, we can see the magnetic orientation as it cools. So the magnetic minerals in it will align with the magnetic field. And if this occurred slowly, you should see something like that picture on the top right, where you'd have 100 kilometers of relatively one direction, about 100 meters of mess, and then 100 kilometers of the other direction. Yet if this occurred fast, we should see flipping every 2 weeks, and basically that will just give us a blotchy mess. Some pattern to it, but mainly blotchiness. And that's exactly what we see. When we dig down deep, when we go through the cores and look at the entire crust, or at least as much as we can dig, we get this kind of pattern here. That's very overlapped as far as the direction of the magnetic field. And other information, other evidence for this, we looked for a 1.5 foot thick basalt lava flow. Because if it's a 1.5 foot thick, that means it's going to take 2 weeks to cool from the outside in. And we're wanting the outside to be pointing one direction with the magnetic field, and then the magnetic field flips, so by the time the inside cools and solidifies, it's pointing the opposite way. And remember, 2 weeks per flip is the average. And so some geologists in 1988, two atheist geologists, went out and actually found this. They weren't looking for it, but they found it. They were then rejected from publishing it because it was impossible, so they got a little chip on their shoulder and went out and proved it. They got a lot of information, a lot of sites promoting this, showing this as a fact. So we have a lot of evidence of the magnetic field flipping very quickly. A big problem for the evolutionary model, but no problem at all for the biblical one. Now, all this hot new ocean crust is going to float higher up because it's less dense. Hot things are less dense. And when it does that, it's going to pour the oceans onto land. It would raise about a mile high, higher than what it would be. And you can see there on the bottom right a chart of the Earth's landmass as far as height goes. Now this wouldn't be the pre-flood Earth. The pre-flood Earth would likely not have been as high or had as deep trenches because those were formed in the flood. But if you were to raise the ocean floor, the majority of the ocean floor, by a mile, it would push all that water onto land. And that brings us from horizontal plate tectonics to vertical plate tectonics, or isostasy. Isostasy is the idea that things will bob on water when moved. So you have these things floating based upon their density. This is all the same density. So the portion of it above to the portion below is going to be the same for each block of wood, basically. And if you were to push on it, to push it down, it will bob. And if you were to change the amount of wood there, it would change its floating in that water. And you can do this at home. You can do this with an ice cube in water. You push it down, it's going to bob up and down. You put that ice cube in honey, it will ruin your honey, but it will bob up and down slower because the honey's thicker. The same thing with the crust that is floating on the mantle. You're going to get a lot of change to that crust. You're going to get some underplating. That's where the bottom of the continental crust was torn away. So of that section of the crust, the center of gravity is higher, meaning for that density then will sink lower, which is why a lot of our ocean shores are relatively low height, low altitude. But then some of that continental crust can be pushed and underplated, moved further inland, meaning that that center of gravity is then lowered, so that has to raise up. And that's why we have the Colorado plateauing. We're also going to get some earth taken off the top and added onto the top. And so remember, if you get the center of gravity reduced, it's going to raise up. And if you raise the center of gravity, it's going to cause the whole thing to shrink a little bit. And all of this will take thousands of years. So we see this today. It's very slow because it's near its end. But right after the flood, it would have been occurring very, very quickly. And even the movement we see today doesn't make sense for the slow plate tectonics, for the evolutionary worldview. K2 and Mount Everest are both moving up and down. And depending on the day, month, or hour, which is tallest may change. This up and down movement doesn't make sense with the evolutionary worldview. Millions of years should not cause such drastic isostasy in the present day. The Appalachian Mountains should not be moving if they are 300 million years old. Yet Cleveland, Tennessee is the most geologically active place east of the Rockies with 3 to 4 earthquakes a day. Now they're small, you may not be able to feel them, but they're there. No slow plate tectonic mechanism would explain this. But if all of this movement is only 4,500 years old, that means that the roots of the mountain, the rock underneath the mountain, is not balanced out yet with the rock on top of the mountain itself. And we can see that there is still a lot of movement going on today. All these are isostasy sites. Now they're, again, occurring relatively slowly today. We don't have many earthquakes, we don't have much volcanism. But during the flood, during the latter half of the flood, and even in the first portion of the flood, but especially in the latter half and then afterwards, a lot of this vertical isostasy would have been occurring. And that would give us a lot of volcanoes. You can see here how the volcanic eruptions are getting smaller and smaller as far as the amount that they are being produced, with the red there being Mount St. Helens. That covered what we think of today as a large area, but compared to the past volcanic eruptions, not so much. And you can't hardly see it as far as the comparison of volume of eruption material. These volcanic eruptions are decreasing in strength as well as frequency, thankfully. The same for earthquakes. The Kingston Range of California is a mountain chain that's about 12 miles long, but it's about 60 miles away from its roots. Something seems to have vibrated this 60 miles, an earthquake so horrible that it caused this mountain to vibrate off of its roots and move a vast distance. They know that its roots are the rock 60 miles away based upon its chemical fingerprint. Thankfully, these kind of earthquakes are no longer occurring. But such earthquakes would have been occurring at the later half of the flood and post-flood. So the world that Noah landed in would have not been a very pleasant world. This material is not in the Bible. We don't hear of volcanoes or earthquakes or moving continents. But the information that we do have with the information that's in the Bible leads us to this conclusion. The Bible simply tells us that God had a horrible judgment because of all the violence in the earth. This gives us a lot more information as far as how just amazingly destructive this judgment was. This was no pleasure cruise that Noah was on. This is an event that I would not want to be on that ark. It would have been a terrifying experience. And I just wonder what was going through Noah's mind, or the mind of his family, during all this. Now take all this with a grain of salt, because all this is being extrapolated using our modern understanding. Some of this may change, but by no means will it change so much to say that none of this happened. The flood is clear in the evidence that we have today. The flood did exist, did occur. and it was horrible. Now I know many of you are visual learners. I know I am. So we're going to be looking at this model and how it shows the continents moving. Now remember, a few lessons ago we talked about the shape of the earth pre-flood. It could be either orientation. We will assume that it's the right-handed orientation, the orientation on the right side, I should say, simply because it makes the most sense with the calculations. So you can see North America there in the top left, Europe and Asia above it, Africa, South America are easy to see. You have other part of Asia over on the far right, India between Asia and Africa, Antarctica at the bottom center, and then Australia at the bottom right. And then we're going to get those to basically today's orientation. First, you're going to have a massive rupture of a number of these into smaller continents. The red is elevation, so the highest portions, while the dark blue is the continent underneath the ocean. The arrows go the direction of the continent movement, with the size of the arrow depicting the speed of the movement. So this is what the earth could have looked like day 20 of the flood. At this time, Noah and his family are still within the ark on land. They're locked in there, safe, but still on land. They have not been uplifted yet. But it is raining pretty heavily for 20 days now. Day 30, you have our first major collision, creating a very high elevation of the continents there. Day 40, you have another collision, and it looks like North America is going to come collide with South America and Africa, while Asia broke off and is moving up north. Now Noah is in the water. The ark has been lifted up, and the rains are slowing down. But the flood is still coming.
About where is the ark in this model?
We don't know. We don't know. I would assume it's on the portion of land that's not moving, but that's just a major assumption. We don't know where Noah was, we just know where he landed. We have another major collision there with everything coming back in, and during these collisions, that's when you would get the supercontinents like Pangaea and such. They would have been mostly underwater, but not completely underwater at these times. Remember, it took some time for the earth to be completely covered. And matching these with certain sedimentary layers, we can see where the coverage was to some extent. But this, we're just focusing on the plate tectonics, the moving of the continents. You now have Asia joining Europe where it is today, basically, at least near where it is today, and relatively little other movement at day 90. Day 110, the flood is near height, its full height, with a lot of movement occurring there. The continents are actually rotating. Now you can see that, I believe that is India, starting to tear off the continent to the south with Australia, and North America turning with Europe and Asia. Then the direction shifts and goes in the reverse. Now Antarctica is being torn off the continent to the bottom. You can now start to see the individual continents. South America and Africa split. North America is being pushed off to the west. India is on its way up to collide with Asia, and Australia and Antarctica go to their relative positions. It is near this point that Noah and the ark are getting close to landing. Not there yet, but near. Most likely it is when Africa and Asia start to collide, and that would have caused, or at least led to the conditions of the forming of the mountains of Ararat. So the mountains would have come up to meet Noah. Not enough to crash him or anything, but enough to catch him basically. So overall, there's a number of questions for the evolutionary model that the biblical model answers. For one, the magnetic striping of the ocean floor matches a fast new crust formation. The sediments trapped in the trenches, we didn't go over this, but there's a lot of sediment in these trenches that should not be there if the long ages view explained everything. It doesn't, but it makes perfect sense if this was only occurring about 4,500 years ago. India colliding with Asia. This formed the Himalayan mountains. It actually pushed under a huge portion of the continental crust of Asia. Now, 4 inches per year would not explain this. 22 miles per hour would, though. And that's how fast this continent collided with Asia. It's like comparing car crashes. You can compare a fast-speed car crash to a slow-speed car crash, and they will produce different kind of wrecks. This is a fast-speed car crash. It also forms certain materials, certain minerals that can only be formed under high pressure below temperature, meaning the high pressure could have only have existed for a period of time, only for a short period of time, where the heat wasn't formed. If this occurred over millions of years, that would have created high heat. So high pressure, high heat minerals, but we don't see those. If this occurred within a year, it would have formed the high pressure, low temperature minerals that we're seeing. And there are a number of other things that explain this, that the biblical model explains that the evolutionary model can't touch. If you want to go into this, there's definitely a number of resources that you can do this. There's definitely that information you can get. It is involved though. You will have to know geology and physics, but there is a lot of cool information in there. There are pictures of rocks of different kinds, so if you do enjoy rocks, you'll have to get into that, but the sheer destruction in this movement is just spectacularly horrendous. This is not the waters coming up, catching the boat, and simply drowning everybody. These creatures, the people alive, were destroyed, obliterated. This was not just a simple drowning. This was an obliteration. For resources, here's a list of some things if you want to know more about the plate tectonics. And then in coming weeks, we'll be going over the waters for the next two, and then the death. There is a lot of death in these rock layers. The sediments from the flood have a lot of that in it. And we'll be going through all the evidence to show how God completely obliterated the pre-flood world. If you have any questions though, let me know. This information will start to pile up. I wish I could integrate it better, but there's just so much of it that we have to go through piece by piece, and unfortunately there's not a set of images that would explain the water rising up, the sediments, and the moving of the continents all at once. So you'll have to compare them side by side to get the full picture. But again, let me know if you have any questions. I hope you all learned something today.
So bottom line is, there's a ton of evidence all these different fields of science are seeing that are explained well, that the biblical model would predict exactly, that fit really well with the Bible. And the evidence really is a head scratcher for the evolutionists.
Yeah, there's some things that they can explain with their model, but by no means everything or even most. And the biblical model will definitely explain more, and it fits with what the Bible tells us.
So we talk a lot of times about, well, we can't prove how the world began, and that's simply because we can't repeat it. There's no way to prove that with repeatable science. But when we look at, okay, here's the evidence, which theory explains it better, we can still get a pretty clear picture.
We can get a very clear picture with the evidence we have. Not a perfect picture, but the evidence is there, and if we can get a good starting point with the Bible and then extrapolate from that, we can get a much clearer picture than if we just look at the evidence without the Bible, because it will explain more things. I feel like I was going to say something else, but I got distracted. But thank you for your comments.
Something about the evolution model not explaining.
Yes, yeah. And the evolutionary model does not explain this because they don't have a good starting point. They don't have the starting point with recorded history of God's Word, with what He tells us what happened. And as such, they get a lot of wrong answers because of that, a lot of mysteries. And we'll be going through a lot of those mysteries here in the next few weeks. There are quite a few of them. And the other thing that all this tells us is it tells us some of the details that aren't in the Bible. God didn't feel it was necessary to write 50 books about the life before the flood. He gave us what we needed. That being said, who doesn't want to know more about what God did? And we can get a very clear picture of what He means by obliterate. It was obliteration. It was spectacular as far as showing the power of God, but also His justice as far as the wickedness that was going on at the time must have been pretty severe. Any other comments before we end?
There's a lot of love there as well.
There is.
In the time it takes Noah to build the flood,
Build the
There's-
ark. Yeah.
Yeah, that one. there's a ton of time for people to think about what's going on and change their ways.
Yeah. I mean, God did bring Noah through this.
Yeah.
I can't get over how horrifying this would have been, but Noah made it through. Noah and his family, all the animals, made it through. With all that I've studied with all this information, I can't imagine that being any other way but by the hand of God. It truly shows his care for Noah and with us as he brings us through all the other destruction in our life. Fortunately, some that we bring upon ourselves.